your permission. Awesome. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Well, super excited to have you all back for another convening. Today's conversation is really special. We have Esther who's joining us. And you know, part of the reason why we started with a little emoji activity is actually really relates with Esther's bio, which I'm going to be reading a little bit. So Esther is most well known by her peers as an excellent meme / personal emoji creator. So for Margaret, there might be a great conversation there with Esther around creating a personalized emoji there. But Esther is also a creative co-conspirator. As the manager of development and communications at North York Women's Shelter, Esther and her team are building a development program that practices the principles of community-centric fundraising. Oh, I'm hearing a little background noise. I'm just gonna, oh, there we go. She continues to create space within systems of oppression to develop engagement and fundraising practices that reduce harm and center community voice and action. She joined the nonprofit sector because of the community-centric fundraising movement and is honored to be a member of the CCF Global Council to continue to hold the sector accountable in its mission and values. As a feminist killjoy and an abashed nerd, she is committed to creating environments that are centered in laughter, curiosity, and justice in the work of equity. Just the kind of person that we love chatting with, and we were so honored when Esther offered to you know share an hour of her time with us and have a chat about this recent article. Now, for most folks, I think you've had a chance to take a look at the article, but if you haven't or you know might have missed it, I'm gonna just quickly put it on the chat just for you to have a reference of what we're gonna chat about. It can definitely go beyond it, and so we don't want to restrict the conversation with the article itself. But Ian and I will start off with a couple of questions based on this, and then we'll just really open up for the rest of you to ask questions and engage with Esther. So with that, thank you again for being here, and I'm going to pass it to Ian to kick us off with our first kind of question to get the conversation going.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you once again, Esther, for taking the time, and for everyone else who's here. So to kickstart the conversation, start with a question that's a little bit on the introductory end. So Esther, I was hoping that maybe you could briefly explain to us what the difference between the scarcity mindset and the abundance mindset is, you know, specifically in the context of fundraising and leadership, because most of the people joining us here today are social leaders and are in a fundraising journey themselves.
Starting off with a light question. I like it. Everyone, it's really great to meet you and be in community with you. Thank you so much for being here and having an hour with me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all. The question about scarcity mindset and abundance mindset, for me as a new leader in the nonprofit, it was kind of interesting to see how much scarcity is a driver. Like all the conversations I was having when we were talking about fundraising practices was like, you hit it, like I said, you hit a goal, but you're actually supposed to exceed it. And for me, it was interesting because I think what we didn't really unpack, or like we only think about how effective it is, but we don't really think about how unsustainable it is. It could, and there's a high turnover rate for fundraisers, generally in the nonprofit, where 2 years tends to be the cap for like an organization, at least where I'm located, which is in Toronto in Canada. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think when you're consistently being told that there's a gap and there's a deficit and you have to not just meet your goal, but exceed it, the cost might not come in the revenue. You might be able to reach the goal, might be able to do it consistently for 2-3 years, but at some point the cost of it personally, emotionally, spiritually even will kind of exceed the benefits of it. And I think what I've been learning so much through my work with my coach and my therapist and basically a lot of great authors is when you actually operate not from scarcity but from abundance, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. Like when you operate from abundance, you will start to seek it, and the way you approach your work, the way you approach building community, the way you mobilize community, it will be the stronger for it. And I think that's what I was ruminating on. Not to say that I would absolutely have an answer, but this was a rumination I've been having, especially in my first year as a leader in the nonprofit sector.
Cool. And just to follow up on that, if a lot of us, I think, felt very connected to that piece when you published it, and I think it came out earlier this year, very recently, um, and it resonated in many sense because a lot of us around the world are usually operating in that kind of mindset of scarcity. How can one actually recognize if they are operating from this scarcity mindset, and what are some strategies they can use to shift towards this abundance mindset? What are ways that you've kind of implemented within your own kind of work and leadership?
You know, part of it really is that unpacking, and well, I can only speak personally because everyone's story of scarcity is so unique and different. Sustain, and especially when you have sustained scarcity and where it happens in your life or where it happens in your career, it's all very different. So I really wouldn't say like there's specific strategies that I could say like blanket, like this is how you combat it. But what I would say has been really, what's been the shift for me is unpacking how culture has taught me scarcity and kind of understanding like, okay, the ways when I as a woman of color live in a world that's saturated with white supremacy, saturated with capitalism, saturated with misogyny, there's ways that I've been taught, consciously or not, that like I have to work twice as hard. I have to make sure I do better. I have to take on extra labor. I have to put a smile and put the emotional labor in as well. There's been ways that this has been taught, though, understanding exactly what hegemonies I've been operating in, like what ways culture tells me I'm insufficient, that I'm not enough. That really puts it in light of, okay, like how much of this has been taught, how much of this is my personal story of scarcity, and even framing it in that light makes me understand it viscerally enough to start to identify my reactions.
It's a really kind of beautiful reflection, because I think in many ways having that conversation also with funders, and I'm curious if you've had a specific conversation about this, whether after this piece came out or even beforehand, and just as a quick follow-up on that, what kind of conversations are you having with funders at this stage about that self-reflection of the process that you're kind of going through here?
I have to say, when this article came out, I was honestly really surprised how much it resonated with everyone. I was really touched that people like reach out to like want to connect and tell me that this is something that they experience, and especially like people that have been in the sector for many years going, yeah, I've seen this, I've felt this, and it's really been an honor to be able to connect with people like on such a vulnerable point almost, and everyone just show up and say, I completely understand this, I completely am in the trenches with you. As for funders, I think I haven't had specific conversations about scarcity with them, but one conversation I will share, and actually Margaret and Chris and everyone that's on my team, I see Margaret, she actually set up a meeting with a donor, and they basically just asked us like, what do you need? Like, what are your fundings going for? And of course the fundraiser in me that's been taught by like the traditional ways wants to go like, there's this very sexy program that's going to like specifically give you these amazing metrics and like et cetera, like, or something about children, which is always a great like sell. And but what I actually told them, and this is where I really had to sit and like how much trust I'm having with the donor, how much trust I have in myself. I just told her, I said, we need unrestricted funding. Most of our funding as a women's shelter, as an emergency shelter, most of our costs are staffing. And we are committed to providing trauma-informed services. If we're going to provide trauma-informed services, it means that we need to compensate well. We need to have benefits. We need to have plenty of sick days. We need to have benefits that are comprehensive, that include therapy. And frankly, funders don't like to hear that money is going to staffing as it's considered an administrative cost. I won't lie, like I'm not gonna frame this story as like I walked out and went like, look at me, I'm not operating scared. Like I was fully scared. Like I came out of that meeting, I was like, I shouldn't have said it quite that level. Like I don't know this person well enough to maybe have said that. But about 6 months later, she came back and she was like, she gave me a phone call and she was like, we want to give you $100,000 over 4 years, unrestricted. We trust you in what you're doing. And I think that was a really big shift for me about how many assumptions I'd made about donors in a lot of ways, or like how much trust I could give them, or like how I thought scarcity is the only driver in these conversations. Like what I was telling her is like the abundance, what I actually need is the abundance of trust in us, in me, in the organization, and what we're doing. And she responded, and to be met in that moment and in that conversation really did shift something for me as a fundraiser.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point of view that you've come with, because I don't think that I would have had the courage to say that, we need unrestricted funding and this is exactly what we're going to do with it. And it's equally shocking to learn that there's people out there who have enough trust in you as an organization to actually do that. And I'm sure that there's many people in this call right now who've had their own stories with funding and essentially operating from a scarcity mindset. And based on that, I'd like to open up the floor so that if anyone has any questions, any comments, or simply anything that they'd like to share, we can all take part in the conversation and hopefully see where that takes us. Yep. So if you'd like to comment or make any question, just feel free to unmute and go ahead.
I'll add a little bit of a comment. I think Esther mentioned I'm part of her team, and I was there in the meeting that she was referring to. And I am much newer to, or at least I was much newer to fundraising than Esther was. And so that had its pros and its cons, in the sense that in that meeting, I didn't think it was weird to mention what our actual needs were, because I hadn't learned that like there were consequences to the fact that people actually like they don't want to hear that. And so I thought like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense to mention that. But in the conversation that we had afterwards was where I really became enlightened to the fact that like, that is not often what donors want to hear, and just learning more about the sector. And what I took away from that, and even what Esther was saying now, is very much that like there has to be, I think it was Abby was saying it was very courageous, and I do think it's courageous. But something to take away from it is like you have to have, there's a tightrope between like being courageous and like common sense because of the industry that you work in, right? So I think even Esther said it wasn't so much that she didn't think that she should say it, it was that she wasn't sure she knew these people well enough. And I think information can only help you. So getting to know who your donors are more and really building that relationship so that they understand your organization more might lead to greater trust, so that then you can have those conversations and it's not so, out of mind. Because I think from the flip side, you can also understand how a donor might not want to trust anyone with their money if they don't feel like they understand why you need it or where it's going. And so then it's like, yeah, I can restrict it to this because I'll know for sure that I think this is important. But if you can help them see how everything you do is important and everything comes together to make these things possible, then, it's an exercise in trust building. That's my comment.
Thank you so much for that, Esther. Sorry, Margaret. I think that was really insightful. And I think I've also had similar experiences in the past. But before I talk about it, let me pass it on to Rogers, who has his hand up.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank Esther for the great article. Actually, I will relate what you wrote on the article about fundraising doesn't make you comfortable. As a young founder, I've noticed it's really difficult when it comes to asking, and how uncomfortable it is. You seated looking for resources, doing research and trying, and you keep on failing. I've been in programs where we are taught mostly on pitch, accelerator pitch, how to do a pitch. But there's something that I want to link with based on the conversation. It's been difficult because you are not taught how to win the donor trust or this person that you're approaching with a pitch. We focus on getting a window for next conversation or next meetup or getting that money, but winning trust, because I don't know whether me pitching for you for the first time will enable you trust me. So I just wanted you to link this with the trust. How do you gain donor trust if you are given opportunity? This is someone that you do not know, but you are reaching out, you have a very good pitch. How do you gain a donor trust? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, it's to be honest, the first thing I'll say is this is a systemic issue in the nonprofit sector as a whole, and it needs to be addressed as such. It's not like an individual fundraiser can continue. Like, we can only do what we can and what we can control, and we can have authentic conversations. We can rebuild that relationship, get that trust like one-to-one. But what I will say is that story is not the rule. That's very much the exception. And I think the work of community-centric fundraising, to shift it to unrestricted, to not have such rigid and rigorous granting structures that don't make sense. Like, I think Vu just posted an article where it was like questions that foundations need to stop asking. And one of them is like, how are you going to sustain this program if we don't fund you? And he's like, well, we're a nonprofit, so we're going to have to continue fundraising. So like, I don't know what you're like wanting me to do, because I'm going to continue fundraising so I can continue doing this program. So I think what you're at, like the donor trust, this is why I really think the nonprofit sector needs to address the toxic foundational issues. Like if you look at how a nonprofit is perceived, if you don't trust us to do the work without you telling us very specifically how you want your money spent, or in the timeline, or like you're going to need rigorous reports for like 20,000, like all of this is basically starting off with a deficit of trust towards a nonprofit. You're saying, I don't actually trust you with how you spend your money, so let me tell you how to do it. And I think that is work that needs to be done by the nonprofit sector, and that needs to be done together. Like, we need to stop, we need to be outspoken about how this is perceived and how people are perceiving the nonprofit sector and like the organizations, because frankly, sometimes it is a bit condescending. It's like, hey, like you do such great work, but also I don't actually trust you with money, but like also keep doing that and I'll applaud you from afar, but like I don't actually want to participate in anything that'll substantiate like actual change. That's something that I think all of us need to reflect. And I mean, everyone in the nonprofit sector too. Like, everyone has to be very aware of how we're complicit in holding up these systems, because there is that halo effect of, I'm in the nonprofit sector, you know, as a fundraiser too, like I brought in X amount of money for my organization, I'm good. If you do that and you don't actually think about the ways you're making it harder for other organizations, you're also part of the problem. And that's something that we need to reflect on. So I guess a long-rounded question to your long-rounded answer to your question, Roger. The first thing I would say in that specific interaction, what I've always tried to adhere to is really the CCF principles of like, the way I approach, I have to be unapologetic about my commitment to equity. And part of that is being honest and transparent. And the thing that I've been really learning this past year is I've been affirmed again and again by interactions. I've also had terrible experiences, like, don't get me wrong, but what I've been affirmed again and again is that I am continuously surprised by people and their willingness to trust. And I think that's also the abundance mindset we kind of have to sit in. It's like, there's more trust to be gained than you would think. People trust you more than you think. And if you are honest, you are authentic, you are really trying to come to the table and say, let's partner on this mission we care about, I do think that that will always already be a better start.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Esther, and great question, Rogers. I got a question that actually connects with that from Jimmy, who isn't able to come off mute, but sent this through the chat, and he was asking, is scarcity mindset really that bad, or is it the extremes of the scarcity mindset that we're talking about? And I'll just kind of leave that question there, but Esther, would love to hear your thoughts on this kind of challenge of, is it really that bad, I guess?
I really, really love this question. You're right, like scarcity mindset, like doesn't it have its functions in a lot of ways? Like there are like undoubtedly, like, and I will say this, like benefits. And I think the value in that question is it kind of steers us away from a binary thinking. Like, you know, if you're a fundraiser with a huge deficit coming next year and I'm telling you like, no, live in abundance, like that's not useful advice. Like you need to be realistic, like you need to manage expectations. So like I think what I would parse out here very carefully is I think not unpacking how scarcity mindset is automatic is what's harmful. Like if if you know what the situation, if you know that there's gaps and there's revenue gaps, are very serious revenue gaps that are coming up. If you know you're going to a year of austerity, that scarcity mindset will serve you 100,000%. It'll teach you how to survive. But like, I think if you are not aware of how it's affecting you and how it's affecting your leadership, how it's affecting your interactions with donors, with your fellow colleagues, with your management team, and with your staff general, I think that's where it will get harmful. So I really, really enjoyed this question. It's actually given me a lot to think about. So thank you for asking it.
We want to make space for more folks to ask questions. So if you do want to ask a question, feel free to come off mute or even a comment. I know Ian and I have a ton of questions we can go on, but we do want to make space. So, oh, there we go. I think it's yes,
Hello.
We can hear. Oh, there you go, Jennifer. Go for it.
Oh, thank you very much. I have a question about abundance, like having abundance. Like, I am wondering if I really have that belief. Yes, I know I have to have trust in myself, believe in myself, but I think, don't you think maybe I can get some level of self-reluctance because I believe now I maybe know much about my project, so I pitch to the funder and he's not believing me. So maybe I think the funder has a problem. So what could you really advise about that?
I just want to make sure I understood your question fully. So if a funder has an issue with your project, is that the question?
No, like, okay, you talked about abundance and scarcity. So if I have a lot of trust in myself, and yes, I know I believe in my project is viable, and then I pitch to the funder or several funders, and maybe I keep failing, but then I have that trust in myself and believe I know all it. I know it all. So couldn't it be create maybe problems for myself and be self-reluctant a little bit?
Yes, I agree with you. Sorry, I did not hear very well, but the first time, but I get it now. Yes, a dose of self-awareness and self-reluctance is always healthy, I would say. Like, and I really do want to be clear about, like, I'm not an expert in abundance and scarcity. This was really a personal reflection and journey that I was having as someone that's kind of came into the sector at a really interesting period of, I entered this sector February 2021. It was pandemic giving. It was like everyone's virtual. I thought donor meetings were all awkward calls on Zoom. I didn't know that it used to be like awkward coffee chats in person. I've only been like in the Zoom meetings. So like for me, that was just a moment of like, I was looking at the sector enduring scarcity in a lot of ways, how that related to me. But I think to your point, I think it's not just like abundance mindset isn't like a self-delusional, like I am perfect, everything will come to me, I don't need to work for it. And I really want to make that clear. It's more of a, especially in the fundraising context, there are abundance of resources that can be, and we know this statistically, we know that there's a lot of wealth that's being carried in private or public foundations that are being dispersed at smaller increments than should be. We know that there's people that are willing to give, even for us as a VA violence against women shelter, when we opened in the pandemic, it was immediate terror of like, how are we going to fundraise and keep us open? But like, actually people were more generous because they understood how important social services were in the pandemic. So I think what I'm trying to say in this point is abundance mindset is really not a delusional, everything's going to come to me if I just believe in myself hard enough. It's just understanding like there is more wealth than I think the nonprofit sector has taught us. There is more generosity. There is more commitment to our missions than we think there is. And I think it's important for us to sit and operate from an understanding that understanding rather than how am I going to meet my goal? How am I going to make sure that I don't look bad as a fundraiser? How am I going to, like, we have to kind of shift our mindset from that to the community resources we care about and looking at the fellow organizations that are doing the work.
Thank you, Esther.
Welcome.
It also reminded me a little bit about something that Margaret was talking about earlier, how like getting to know your donors is such an important part of that process, and being able to actually kind of invest in researching. I think that's one of the things that like pitching and pitch competitions and the whole kind of like the standard in many countries around the world is become this like 30-second, 60-second idea of go to tell as many people about your ideas and hopefully one person will fund most of your work. And I think in many ways that's so untrue. It's mostly a large group of smaller, donations that really fuel a lot of the work. And there isn't that kind of like, pitch to funding solution. At least I haven't seen as much of it, not in a sustainable way. But I think when you're in a pitching mindset, and I'm not creating another mindset of sorts, but like that constant idea of like, I have to pitch all the time, you're always trying to guess who the other person is without really trying to understand who they really are. And that's really tricky. I had a similar pitch moment a couple of weeks ago when I was talking to a foundation. I do fundraising for my organization, and I went around telling them about all the wonderful things we've done and our traction, and how many people we worked with and how much money we raised. And at the end of the meeting, they concluded that we weren't qualified for funding, because obviously I think pitching way too much than I should have. But their kind of reason for not qualifying was that we were like too big for them. And that's where abundance feels really tricky for one, because I hadn't done the research to know that this foundation supports a certain budget kind of range and they have their structure. And so for them, I was like an abundant organization. I had already like gathered enough resources, and it was really a mismatch, really, rather than anything else. I think that piece around like researching and investing and kind of understanding your donors is a key piece as well.
I really like that point, because like you said, the pitching or like I don't know, like fundraisers, the best part of fundraising for me is when you actually connect with someone that genuinely cares about the mission and you're really giving them the opportunity to invest in it. My coach always tells me like corporations, foundations, it's all just people. It doesn't really matter. Like, and we're not like going to someone has no interest in our mission and going like, hey, you should give me money just because I asked you to. Like, what we're really presenting them is an opportunity to really have a big impact on we work for Northwark Women's Shelter. Our mission is to end gender-based violence. How many times does the average person get an opportunity to actually substantially change and affect this mission in their community? Not many opportunities. So like us presenting it to them, it's not about me selling. It's just about cultivating relationship to say, oh, this is something you've clearly expressed interest in. Here is the opportunity. And it's a meeting them there and meeting each other where we are, rather than me trying to bring you into what I think you should do. And that's kind of, for me, that work with my coach has really, again, shifted my fundraising approach drastically, and also really helped me temper, like if someone says no, it's just that it's not the right moment, or like it's just not the mission that's as like maybe not the mission that speaks mostly to them. Not to say that I don't like dwell in the anxiety and like kind of hate myself for a second when I get a no, but like I still do, it depersonalizes it a bit when you think of it like that.
I was just going to add something that I have sort of gotten between like Roger and Jennifer's question and what you said, Abby, and obviously what Esther said is, I guess when we have these conversations, again, like I'm new-ish to the sector, and I think when we think of community-centric fundraising, we focus a lot on the fundraising part of that like phrase and a lot less on the community-centric. And even the way we think of community as this like thing that is like small and very like deep. It can also be a much like wider thing. So when you're thinking of how to build trust with donors, if you think of those donors as part of your like wider community, like Esther said, you want to be pitching or speaking to people who are already inclined to support your mission or organizations like yours. So like if they have like budget restrictions and your organization doesn't meet that, it's a lot of extra, like you're fighting an uphill battle already, and then you're adding extra sort of stones to that like battle. So maybe it might be more helpful to look for organizations that, you know, you're within their restrictions of whatever amount and everything. And then from there, try and like have, you know, see if there are ways to build community. I think it was Roger who was saying like about no, actually, I think it was Abby who was saying about where they sort of say to you, okay, like, what's your pitch or whatever, and like, go, you have like 30 seconds. And my immediate thought when you said that, I would use my 30 seconds to say, why do you think I should have a 30-second pitch to tell you about like, I'll challenge that person, because that's ridiculous. Like if I could tell you what we were doing in 30 seconds, I probably wouldn't need your support. Like, you know, like, and obviously, again, that goes back to like what Esther was saying, the balance between like having the courage to say what you actually need to say, and then the common sense to know who you're talking to. But putting some of that, like challenging the system that we're in, like Esther said, it's systemically, it's not set up in a way that is the most efficient, that is the most helpful. So sometimes doing some pushback and just being like, you're inviting me to pitch on like this program or my organization, and you're giving me a minute or 30 seconds, and it feels like you don't actually want to know what we want to do, because if you did, then I would at least have 10 minutes of your time to have a coffee and tell you, this is what we're doing. This is how, like, I've been speaking for more than 30 seconds at this point. Like how, I don't know how you guys are, like how that's expected to be feasible. So that's something to like, if there's room, something to consider, something to try and push back on. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the contribution, Margaret. I can see John has his hand up, so maybe we can take his contribution.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you.
So I think your internet is slightly cutting off, John. It might be helpful if you turn off your camera, maybe it will be.
Sure. Yes, Abby, I was asking about donor cultivation cycles. And I also would like to know, how does the scarcity mentality harm a leader? Because I was reading that phrase and it touched me. So I wanted to know, how does the scarcity mentality affect the leader? What's more about donor cultivation cycles? And how do you count on how many people in the communication under donor cycles?
So how does the scarcity mindset affect donor cultivation cycles? Is that the main question?
I think he was talking about how it affects like your leadership, your ability to lead your team, and then obviously donor contribution.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think with the scarcity mindset in terms of how it affects my leadership, I think this goes to anyone. I think it's important, especially for leaders, but I think it is for everybody. When you're operating out of scarcity, like true, like kind of sustained scarcity mindset, I think it affects you being able to actually build and imagine and vision, which are actually the key qualities of a fundraiser. Like fundraising work is located in the future. You're trying to think about what programs our community needs, what community and future we want to build. And I think what we're not thinking about is, in the pursuit of revenue for this fiscal or next fiscal, and only looking at that, what are we actually preventing ourselves from seeing holistically for what our community might need more largely, more sustained in a more sustained way. And in terms of how that relates to donor cultivation cycles, I think, yeah, like I do think it affects it in the sense of like, you know, I heard this story that someone said they got a major gift and then they were like, they found out it was for the next fiscal, not this one. And they were like, oh, darn, like, I wish it was for, they'll help me this goal. And I just remember like, obviously it's a very cringe story for like every fundraiser, but like, that is kind of a symptom of like what happens when you really operate out of scarcity. If you're not meeting your goal and you hear that you're going to get money, like that's great for the organization, it's great for the company. But if you're so nervous about not meeting your specific targets and looking back you as a fundraiser, and you don't get to see how this donor just gave you a substantial amount of money to go to devote to your mission that you spoke so much about, that you convinced them to do, like that for me is a perfect example of like, how do you treat our donors? Like, are you just trying to get something transactional out of them where you say, this year I need this much money and I'm going to hit my goal, and then next year I'll come back to you and do it again? What we actually need to kind of start to expand on is like, how are we actually bringing people into the mission? How are we actually trying to bring them on the journey of the work we're doing? Because the work we're doing is not going to be done in 1 or 2 fiscals. It's a long-term goal. And how do we ensure that donors understand that and are committed to this? Not just in money, but like in terms of advocacy, or in terms of just being with you and trusting you and cultivating this trust throughout.
I think that was a really detailed answer. And before I ask my question, I'll turn it over to Joseph just to briefly comment on the topic as well.
Oh, I was gonna ask. Can you hear me? I was gonna ask Esther. This might have been hinted at, but to what extent could this issue of scarcity mindset be in part structural? That being, say, donors, they come from the business world, and when they set up these foundations, they only required, for example, to give 5% of the overall money that they have per year. And now you have what's called donor advised funds, and they could keep the money there, I think indefinitely. So yeah, I guess the question is, to what extent is what's driving the scarcity mindset? Could it be like the structural part of the system, and then the mindset that certain donors bring coming from the business world was pretty cutthroat, and the bottom line is profit.
I think it's okay, I'll say like this. My story is very personal. So like what I would say about the scarcity mindset and how it pervades the nonprofit sector, we do have to pause and step back and realize that the nonprofit sector was created fundamentally from the ground up out of capitalism. It was looking at government structures that were not doing what they said they do in a way, and the way government models shifted to say social services are no longer a duty that we need to take care of. These small like organizations or churches or all sorts of philanthropic organizations, they are the ones that will take care of the people most vulnerable in our society. So like when you think of it like that, and you really put it in a historical context of like how the nonprofit sector was founded, the reasoning why it was founded, you kind of understand that this sector is built for generally really wealthy white people in power to distribute money to usually communities colors, and that's how it's kind of evolved to be. And it's not a surprise if you look at the historical context of how the nonprofit sector was born in a lot of ways. And I mean the industrial complex of nonprofit. I don't just mean like, church meals. So like that's also a different and very beautiful form of philanthropy, but I really mean the industrial complex. When you think of it like that, and like to your point, how donor advised funds and the policies that government makes about like how much it actually needs to be dispersed every year, that's still something that's like has to be done in policy. You do realize how structural and systemic this is. And you do realize kind of the work ahead, I think, as like if we're really, and this is the question I would pose to anyone that talks about equity in fundraising or equity in nonprofit sector, like how much work are you actually willing to put in to ensure this happens on a systemic level? And that's a big ask for a sector that's chronically underfunded, chronically overworked. It attracts people that want to do this work because they felt oppression or like have experienced sustained scarcity. Like it's a big ask, and that's something that we need to think about as well. Like it's work that needs to be done, and it's something that we all have to be committed to move the needle. And it's something that a lot of people leave this sector out because of burnout, because of just having years of like, pouring their heart and soul and energy into a sector that doesn't love them back. And I think we're kind of at a tide wave of like, what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do to stop pushing talent out? What are we going to do to actually make this sector like sustainable? What are we going to do to hold people accountable, people with wealth that, create foundations just so that they can like, hoard wealth? Like, what are we going to do about these things? And these are big questions, especially for in my time a Wednesday morning, but things that we do need to think about.
Thank you so much for that response, Esther. And thank you for your question, Joseph, as well, because that's something that I actually haven't thought about as I was going through the document, and has shed a lot of light in terms of how I view the entire system around fundraising, its relation to capitalism, and how that affects our own perspective in terms of the scarcity mindset. And Esther, as you were answering, you mentioned a term that I think is very important in this discussion, which is equity. And based on that, allow me to take you to your work with the community-centric fundraising program, because I understand one of the key pillars around that fundraising is the whole principle of equity and ensuring that social impact is something that's democratized. And I think that's something that most of the people here would be interested about. So if you could just briefly take us through how the community-centric fundraising works and what your work is and which programs that you have, I think that would be really valuable for everyone who's there on the call right now.
Sure. And I really want to make clear, I'm not an expert in community-centric fundraising, and I would very much doubt anybody that says they are. The work of community-centric fundraising is really just continuously reflecting on what practices in fundraising or nonprofit work have we been, perpetuating that are actually harmful to the communities that we're trying to serve. And the second thing I would say is to put community-centric fundraising in a nutshell. It was a movement created by mostly women of color in the Seattle area in USA around 2020. And when it was a response to kind of the inherent injustices they've been facing as people in the nonprofit sector, and just seeing how the system is skewed to have wealthier white people tell communities of color how they should receive support. And that's just basically the fundamental refusal of and I think it's a response. Why we say community-centric is that in fundraising, like when we talk about donor-centered fundraising, where you put the donor on a pedestal, you say, they gave us money, thank you so much, we couldn't have done it without you. And instead kind of shifting it to thinking about, we all need this. It's not just pure altruism, like you benefit from it just as much as we do. We value time as much as money. And all the work we do in nonprofit must be grounded in anti-racism, anti-oppression. It must be grounded in equity to actually be doing good. That would be my Cliff's notes of community-centric fundraising. So the work that I do on the Global Council, it's a new council, and it's made up of 25 beautiful people from around the world, who are really gathering every couple of weeks to kind of go, how do we make sure this movement continues to mobilize? Like the founding council, so those are the people that originally created this movement. They did such a wonderful, amazing job of making sure that this is a word that's been floating around enough so that people all know what community-centric fundraising is. And now the task of the Global Council is ensuring that we're actually representing global interests, that we're not just, focusing on North America, which fundraising tends to do, and really trying to think about how we can take this movement and be inclusive and make sure that everyone feels they belong, and also understands, give them resources or make space so that people can connect. There's there's a lot of interesting projects right now. Like two of my peers on that council, they actually spearheaded a response to AFP Chicago chapter. So there were two women of color that felt that they were harmed by the AFP Global AFP Chicago chapter, and actually 2 or 4 of the council members sat down with them and like help pen like a paper saying we resist this, we disagree with this, we think you should apologize. And for me, that was like one of those tangible actions of like, this is what the Global Council is about, making sure that we're all held accountable to values of equity within fundraising, because that shouldn't be just reserved for commissions that are committed to social change in that way. It should be about for everybody that's in this work.
I love that. And thanks, Ian, for sharing the link for folks. I know the initial article also linked to the page, but please do check out. I think the values is something that we've really admired a lot. And I think going back to some of the kind of pure support that the Global Council is providing, it I think also goes back to this idea around, and perhaps connects with this idea of scarcity, is around the competition that a lot of fundraisers have with each other. And I'm not sure if everyone in this council is raising funding actively. I imagine many of them are. And being able to actually create a space where there's more collaboration or more kind of peer mentorship and guidance happening is refreshing. I think we're all, and most of the folks in this call, we all took a fundraising class. That's how we got to Little Big Fund, is we offer these fundraising courses, different cohorts. I took one of the first ones in back in 2017, and over the time we've become this kind of community that keeps growing, and almost every one of us have felt this experience of found a funder or met a funder or heard of a funder and know that 15 other people could apply for that funding, and you have this that kind of dilemma, like, do you apply for it, just make it your thing, and you have to meet your metrics and you have to meet your goals and you have to meet your targets, all about the I, or do you make this into a community where you can actually share with each other, maybe learn, maybe collaborate? And I think that shifting, it goes back to this colonial concepts, which every one of us, I mean, we're calling in from all the way from South Asia, East Africa, and Latin America. All of our countries and communities around the world have that reminiscence so very, very present, especially in philanthropy, or especially in giving, or in many countries. And I think in the way nonprofit sector is even created is supposed to be this fitting way. And so I think it's really helpful to have these values as perhaps pillars. Maybe not everything can fit everywhere around the world, but being able to actually refer to it in conversation, I think, is really helpful. And I think it does take a ton of courage to have these conversations, but it's good to start in a safe community like this one and take it from there. So thanks for sharing. I just want to kind of add that.
Yeah, of course. I'll tell you, before I even joined the sector fully, full time, I think one of the first events I attended was a CCF BIPOC meeting, and I was in it, and it was just so cool to have I think it was 300 nonprofit people committed to equity and justice in their work, in a virtual room. But a lot of people were I've never seen so many people of color fundraisers in one room, and something about this is so affirming to my soul, to see us out there struggling against these mechanisms of white supremacy, and still wanting to do this good work, and still wanting to show up and take space and make sure that we are heard and seen. And that was really what made me want to participate in this movement in any way I can. And honestly, I'll tell you, the best thing about being on this council is how open we are about not knowing what to do next. We are all okay, this is the goal, how do we get there? Even the fact that there's 25 people. So I'll share my so there was a mini application which I did, and they actually chose to interview 25 people out of the applicants. Then afterwards, 2 weeks later, they sent an email and said, hey, we were going to try and reduce the council to 8 people. We just came up with the number 8, probably because of board members. And then we were like, why? We loved every single one of you. We think all of you bring a unique POV. We don't know what this is going to look like. 25 people in a council, how do we make decisions? What structures are we going to make? Having said that, going into every meeting, everybody committed to the mess of it, committed to the not knowing, being curious about it, knowing that we're all committed, unshaken in our values, but unclear on the exact next steps forward. That has really taught me more than anything that if you are going to do CCF work, you have to throw away any pretense of, I will know, this is new, this is this is new, this is exciting, it's terrifying, and you have to make space for all these emotions. And being in community in like moments like this, that one that we're having right now, are the only way we're going to move forward. So again, I appreciate everything you said, and I just wanted to say again how wonderful it is to be in a room with like everybody's coming from the different parts of the world, and like I did not expect it to be so cool. Like I'm like this, like I'm so excited. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your time and yeah, opening up these ideas with us. We call our convenings or informally call it kind of like a coffee shop gathering, which nonprofit leaders never can either afford or have the time to do because they're too busy doing everything else. And it's the one hour a month where we just sit down and talk about some of the more like deeper elements around why we do what we do, and it's really helpful to have different perspectives. So really thank you for that. I know we're wrapping up with time and we only have a couple more minutes. So if anyone else has a question, please either come off mute, raise your hand, put it in the chat. I did want to ask a quick kind of closing question, Esther. In your article, you talk a little bit about your transition into the space, and it actually happened through a course. You kind of learned to be a fundraiser in many ways. And we love to kind of create a space of learning. And so I'm just curious, is there a book, podcast, and author that really kind of helped you make that transition? Perhaps someone from CCF, someone maybe else that you would recommend this community to maybe look to learn from or seek out?
Yes, and Ian, if you could do me a favor and drop these in the chat for me, like so that everyone can have a link to it, that'd be amazing. I will tell you the two. Okay, I'll stick to three books that have been really fundamental in my work. The first one would be a collection of experiences of Black fundraisers in North America. It's called Collecting Courage. So I read this before I even really entered the sector fully. And actually the editor is my coach, actually our coach. She helps us all. So that actually, I'll tell you why that was fundamental to me. I always knew and heard academically about the oppressions in place that are unique to the nonprofit sector, but reading these stories kind of gave me visibility and understanding that there are people courageous enough to state this openly. And that was part of the reason I came. I'd never been in a sector where it wasn't just racism is happening and you hate, like you go and tell your, they were willing to confront the system because they believe in the sector enough to say, we can heal and we can go forward, but it must first be that we open and excavate all the rot, the depth of it, and then we can go forward. And for me, that book was like, okay, I'm not saying that it's going to be perfect or that it's going to like be great in a lot, but like at least I know that there are people in this sector that are willing to put this sector to account. That gave me immense hope. Second one I would say is Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. I'm sure you've heard of it at the very least, but I do mention him in the article as well. He mentioned that in a conference actually at the end, and that really did shift my understanding of what it means to be a fundraiser. And I think when we're talking about CCF values, like this is not new knowledge. Indigenous people, this is how, like building relational, this is all knowledge that they have had, that colonialism has kind of taught us to erase or dismiss or undervalue. So on reading Edgar Villanueva's work and him saying it so poetically and so impactfully really did shift my mind. The third one is one that I'm currently reading, and it's called In My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about racialized trauma in the body. I recommend this to everybody, not just people that are racialized. I actually recommend this to everybody because I think when we're talking about fundraising or nonprofit work in a lot of ways, we're talking about the work of healing. And I think when we're talking about healing and like what we've endured, what pain we carry generationally as an individual from the systems, like we do need to be able to go in with open eyes. And this book, I think I'm like 2 chapters in, and I've already learned so much. And this has actually broadened my perspective in ways that, yeah, that's all I'll say. Read it for all 3 of those.
Love it. We're going to get pretty busy in the next few months, so this is really helpful. A couple of years ago, we brought a snippet. We weren't obviously able to get introductions with the author, but part of the book of Edgar Villanueva was is really reflective of some of the international development work that happens. And so we brought a snippet and had a conversation in this group as well. But I love these recommendations, and thank you, Ian, for sharing these in the chat as well, so folks can bookmark them and save them as well. Awesome. Any final questions? I think we've got 0, 0. We're at 0, 0. So I don't think we'll manage to do more questions, but we're going to share again the links to CCF and some of the principles that we've talked about today, so that everyone in this meeting can continue to learn and be involved or be a part of this community. I think a big part of building a goal of international group of fundraisers and nonprofit leaders is to also introduce different principles, and I think this is one of the most impressive ones that Gail and I have admired for a while now. So thank you, Esther, for sharing your time, your wisdom, your insights, your recommendations with us. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. Hopefully we can have you back again sometime soon. We'll obviously be following your writings and your work and your memes at some point. But yes, thank you again for your time. And everyone else, thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. We hope it's been a meaningful hour in a otherwise perhaps busy week, I'm sure. And look forward to seeing you again for our next convening in March. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. And have a lovely rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you.